In Prague, I met up with Liebe Taylor, whose task it was to attempt to guide me through a maze of Kafka sites. I've come here because I'm researching for an essay I'm writing about Kafka, and in particular about a short story he wrote here in Prague called A Country Doctor.
Yes, I mean, one of his biographers says that...
With somewhat inexorable logic, our first stop is Kafka's place of birth.
But this is his birth house.
Right on the corner there.
And there is that statue on the corner.
Okay, so he gets the cafe with black coffee and the nice little flower baskets along here. He gets the strange bas relief on the corner of the house, and he gets a street named after him, or a place, the square. Then he gets a whole square. He'd have loved it, wouldn't he? How big do you think the Jewish community in Prague is now? Two people maybe.
Well, you know, it's funny because we don't even have a Jewish rabbi. He's not actually technically Jewish because his mother is not Jewish.
Well, it's only Jews who say that. It's only Jews who say that.
You know.
No, I tell people my mother was Jewish, they go, you're Jewish. It's only Jews who say that. No, I just wonder if there's anybody to read the Hebrew. So, at around the time of Kafka's birth, the German-speaking population in Prague was about 30,000. Of them, maybe half were Jews. So Kafka was inside an ethnic minority, inside a linguistic and cultural minority, islanded in an increasingly Czech-speaking exterior, under the pressures of Czech nationalism. And within that, I could have fought that guy. It could have been a description of a struggle. It could have been good. And within that, captured by this kind of architecture, this is another kind of ghetto. He's within a ghetto here as well. He's confined in this small central area where almost all the German speakers were.
The next day, we went in search of a small village, Suren, where Kafka lived for a while after having been diagnosed with tuberculosis.
We need to be here.
I thought we were on the main
I think maybe we overshot it.
This was the sort of environment that he pictures in his story, A Country Doctor.
I was in great difficulty. An urgent journey was facing me. A seriously ill man was waiting for me in a village 10 miles distant. A severe snowstorm filled the space between him and me. I had a carriage, a light one with large wheels, entirely suitable for our country roads. Wrapped up in furs with the bag of instruments in my hand, I was already standing in the courtyard ready for the journey, but the horse was missing. The horse. My own horse had died the previous night as a result of overexertion in this icy winter. My servant girl was at that very moment running around the village to see if she could borrow a horse. But it was hopeless. I knew that, and I stood there useless, increasingly covered with snow, becoming all the time more immobile. The girl appeared at the gate alone. She was swinging the lantern. Of course. Who is now going to lend her his horse for such a journey? I walked once again across the courtyard. I couldn't see what to do, distracted and tormented. I kicked my foot against the cracked door of the pigsty, which had not been used for years. The door opened and banged to and fro on its hinges. A warmth and smell as if from horses came out. A dim stall lantern on a rope swayed inside. A man huddled down in the stall below showed his open, blue-eyed face. "Shall I hitch up?" he asked, crawling out on all fours. I didn't know what to say and bent down to see what was still in the stall. The servant girl stood beside me. One doesn't know the sorts of things one has stored in one's own house, she said. And we both laughed. Hey brother, hey sister, the groom cried out, and two horses, powerful animals with strong flanks, shoved their way, one behind the other, legs close to the bodies, lowering their well-formed heads like camels, and getting through the door space, which they completely filled, only through the powerful movements of their rumps. But right away they stood up straight, long-legged, with thick steaming bodies. Help him, I said, and the girl obediently hurried to hand the wagon harness to the groom. But as soon as she was beside him, the groom puts his arms around her and pushes his face against hers. She screams out and runs over to me. On the girl's cheek were red marks from 2 rows of teeth. You brute, I cry out in fury. Do you want the whip? Kafka writes so much about movement. You know, that opening scene in The Country Doctor, it's all about movement. It's all about movement, some fast movement, some crazy movement. It's all about posture. It's all about the way people hold their bodies. It's all about the way that they physically interact. And yet there's no sense of his physicality in a way in this place. It's going to take me a while here. Here we are, sort of suffering the kind of, see, I think Kafka foretold the digital world. I think his permanent, you know, I think it's Elias Canetti who says of him that, you know, the Kafkaesque moment is always the moment of the kind of anticipation of a kind of limitless number of possibilities that is potentiated by any action. That seems to me what the kind of digital world torments us with, is this kind of strange, so this one I like a lot. The true path is along a rope, not a rope suspended way up in the air, but rather only just over the ground. It seems more like a tripwire than a tightrope.
Returning to Prague, I wanted to find a famous balcony, a site of a terrible childhood trauma experienced by Kafka at the hands of his father.
So, you know, this is in his letter to his father.
That's where the trauma started.
This is one of the pivotal traumas of his life. So here is House Minuta, and they were here for 8 years. And here, Kafka's 3 sisters, Ellie, Vali, and Otla, were all born. Excuse me, can you see the old courtyard of the building inside of House Minuta? Can you see inside? It's not possible. She speaks Czech, you can tell her.
Ne, protože tam má být nějaký...
Ale není to vidět.
Ah, fantastic. Thank you so much. So this is where Franz Kafka,
Yeah, it's a Franz
yes,
Kafka here.
and his daddy put him on one of these balconies.
Just 2 years?
Yeah.
Just live
No, they were no longer than that. They were here at House Minuta for 9 years, 8 years,
8 years,
1889 to 96.
Okay.
And his father put him on one of these balconies. He kept saying, Daddy, Daddy, I want a glass of water, I want a glass of water, I can't sleep, Daddy, get me. And his father put him on one of these balconies. That was it. That was it. That was it between them. It was over. Thank you so much.
Thank you for you. For information and everything. Jukněte se, foťte si, co potřebujete.
So this is the characteristic begging posture of Prague. Why would you choose to supplicate yourself in such an overpowering way? Will they be Czechs or will they be from further east?
I don't know. Actually, they could be from anywhere.
They could be from anywhere. Let's ask him. What are these?
This is £1, £2 almost.
Okay. Here you go. Where are you from? No, ask him where he's from. You're Czech. From Prague?
This is Prague.
Okay. And you're welcome. That'll do. It's like the kind of, you know, in some cities you get people pretending to be statues. But you know, they're kids, they're middle class kids who've been to university. Kafka is a writer that, if you read him when you're an adolescent, has an enormous impact, because lurking behind the ideas and the language is this moaning, fetching, tormented, sexually obsessed adolescent mind. You think? I think there is. In some of the, a lot of stuff. Anyway, he really speaks to, and if you're a writer and you read him when you're young,
Yeah.
he's very influential. You know, you can think of lots of writers in the English language whose first books are Kafkaesque. Ian McEwan would be another example. His novella, The Concrete Garden, is a Kafkaesque story in which the children murder their parents and bury them beneath the back garden. So, and the stuff he's written subsequently is very different. It's naturalistic, it's realistic. So he lost the Kafkaesque feel to his work. Some people say that in German he's a really quite funny writer. He's amusing. Even funnier than the Museum of Torture. I think he was ambivalent about his work. He both loved and hated it, the way that most serious writers are, but that his own personality was one of such rigid perfectionism that he felt, when he flipped over to hating it, he hated it more. He constantly saw what he had failed to achieve. Though actually in the instructions he gives to his friend Max Brod to destroy the work, they're ambiguous. And Brod said that he, when Kafka said to him that he was going to do this, Max Brod said to him, well, you know, if you make me your literary executor responsible for your papers after your death, I will disobey your wishes. So now why would Brod lie about that? You know, he said if Kafka knew that, and if Kafka knew that he was going to disobey it, then why did he stay with it, you know?
Well, I think we have... It's a Cubist cafe, so it was built in the Cubist period.
Right.
And
He went to cafes and he was a salonier, he went to saloons and he talked and he laughed and he flirted. The image we have of a gloomy, tormented man to some extent comes later, and of course his friends always said of him that there's a big disjunction between when you read what he writes and things like Letters to My Father or in his journals and what he was actually like in person. In person he was a barrel of laughs. This is beautiful, isn't it? Oh, you can smoke in the restaurant. Fantastic.
You know,
so most restaurants have a smoking section.
Yeah.
Oh, we're going to have to go and smoke in a restaurant. I haven't been able to do that in London for 10 years.
Yeah, you can do it.
How exciting is that? It's like a time capsule. But I immediately remember that he is a stranger, that I don't know where he comes from, and he's helping me out of his own free will when everyone else is refusing to, as if he knows what I was thinking. He takes no offense at my threat, but turns around to me once more, still busy with the horses. Then he says, "Climb in." And in fact, everything is ready. I noticed that I've never before travelled with such a beautiful team of beasts. And I climb in happily. "But I'll take the reins. You don't know the way," I say. "Of course," he says. "I'm not going with you. I'm staying with Rosa." "No!" screams Rosa and runs into the house with an accurate premonition of the inevitability of her fate. I hear the door chain rattling as she sets it in place. I hear the lock click. I see how, in addition, she runs down the corridor and through the rooms, putting out all the lights in order to make herself impossible to find. "You're coming with me," I say to the groom, "or I'll give up the journey, no matter how urgent it is. It's not my intention to give you the girl as the price of the trip." "Giddy up," he says, and claps his hands. The carriage is torn away like a piece of wood in a current. I still hear how the door of my house is breaking down and splitting apart under the groom's onslaught. And then my eyes and ears are filled with a roaring sound which overwhelms all my senses at once. But only for a moment. Then I am already there, as if the farmyard of my invalid opens up immediately in front of my courtyard gate. The horses stand quietly. The snowfall has stopped. Moonlight all around. The sick man's parents rush out of the house. His sister behind them. They almost lift me out of the carriage. I get nothing from their confused talking. In the sick room, one can hardly breathe. The air, the neglected cooking stove is smoking. I want to push open the window, but first I'll look at the sick man. Thin, without fever, not cold, not warm, with empty eyes, without a shirt. The young man under the stuffed quilt heaves himself up, hangs around my throat, and whispers in my ear, "Doctor, let me die." I look around. No one has heard. The parents stand silently, leaning forward, and wait for my opinion. The sister has brought a stool for my handbag. I open the bag and look among my instruments. The young man constantly gropes at me from the bed to remind me of his request. I take some tweezers, test them in the candlelight, and put them back. Yes, I think blasphemously. In such cases, the gods do help. They send the missing horse, even add a second one because it's urgent, and even throw in a groom as a bonus. Now, for the first time, I think once more of Rosa. What am I doing? How am I saving her? How do I pull her out from under this groom 10 miles away from her with uncontrollable horses in the front of my carriage? These horses, who have somehow loosened their straps, are pushing open the window from outside. I don't know how. Each one is sticking its head through a window and, unmoved by the crying of the family, is observing the invalid. I'll go back right away, I think, as if the horses were ordering me to journey back. But I allow the sister, who thinks I am in a daze because of the heat, to take off my fur coat. A glass of rum is prepared for me. The old man claps me on the shoulder. The sacrifice of his treasure justifies this familiarity. I shake my head in the narrow circle of the old man's thinking. I was not well. That's the only reason I refuse to drink. The mother stands by the bed and entices me over. I follow, and as a horse neighs loudly at the ceiling, lay my head on the young man's chest, which trembles under my wet beard. That confirms what I know. The young man is healthy. His circulation is a little off, saturated with coffee by his caring mother, but he's healthy and best pushed out of bed with a shove. I'm no improver of the world, and let him lie there. I am employed by the district and do my duty to the full, right to the point where it's almost too much. Badly paid, but I'm generous and ready to help with the poor. I still have to look after Rosa, and then the young man may have his way, and I want to die too. What am I doing here in this endless winter? My horse is dead, and there's no one in the village who'll lend me his. I have to drag my team out of the pigsty. If they hadn't happened to be horses, I'd have had to travel with pigs. That's the way it is. And I nod to the family. They know nothing about it, and if they did know, they wouldn't believe it. Incidentally, it's easy to write prescriptions, but difficult to come to an understanding with people.
Kafka's on-off fiancée was a young woman from Berlin called Felice Bauer.
It looks different to me. Let's check it out again, man.
She had no connection with the city of Prague apart from her relationship with the writer, and yet somewhere on this street her name has been curiously immortalized.
Their relationship was a mésalliance from the get-go, introduced by Max Brod. It went on in fits and starts for about 4 years with 2 engagements and 250,000 words expended on Kafka's part in a correspondence that for sheer attritional unpleasantness is probably unrivaled in the history of letter writing. On his deathbed, Kafka was asked about her, and I think he said words to the effect that she wasn't a bonny girl, but she had a quick and lithe body or something of that form. It's difficult in a way to explain his attraction to her. She travelled in office equipment in a kind of early form of the dictaphone, so she was oddly on the kind of cutting edge of technology in the 1900s and kind of office equipment. And, you know, she was independent and well set up young woman, you might say. And presumably her family felt that even a marriage to the rather etiolated Kafka, who after all had his doctorate, was a qualified lawyer, and worked here for the Kingdom of Bohemia's workers' insurance organisation, was better than nothing. But it's, you know, in the context of Kafka's life and then of this obsessive and ultimately fruitless relationship with Felice Bauer, the Felice Brasserie Parisienne really stands out in a Prague full of not so much Kafkaology as kind of Kafka-tatology, as a really startling example. Anyway, let's go into the insurance office, as was now the Hotel Century.
Entering the premises of this nondescript upper middle range international hotel, in the middle of the foyer we discovered a bust of the man himself.
So, the Prague Workers' Insurance Association, where Kafka worked on, and latterly, as his tuberculosis began to take its toll, off for 14 years, and which many people feel forms the kind of, you know, buff backdrop to the writer's obsession with grinding and, you know, logic chopping, obfuscatory bureaucracies. But in fact, Kafka was a well-liked employee here, rose up to being a senior clerical officer, given a lot of responsibility for judging the validity of workers' claims for insurance. It was a scheme introduced under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Kafka, you know, in the line of famous kind of clerical writers of the 19th century who, you know, may have been kind of an early 20th century, may have been tied to their desks and bemoaned the work they had to do, but somehow acquired perhaps a sort of freedom of mind and thought and a kind of intensity of focus on their creative work that was allowed for by the fact that they were engaged with something so kind of other during their working lives. You know, not for Kafka, the kind of imprisonment of Grub Street and the daily churning out of cultural bubble wrap for various publications that some of us are engaged in. He never, you know, wrote notes or extensive first drafts. He tended to write in kind of, you know, single drafts with a great intensity after a lot of thought and and concentration, and there is very little of his writing outside of the fabulous fiction itself. There's one piece about a air show at Brescia that he attended with Max Brod and his brother, and that's about the only kind of bit of journalism, let alone journalism, that Kafka ever indulged in, and a sort of kind of purity and obsession with his fictional muse was kind of unparalleled, in some ways rather monstrous. They're not going to let us into this room because it's had a guest in there and the guest is left and it's messy. Maybe we could prevail upon this Czech chambermaid to clean it up for us in advance. It's a situation that has all the strange sexual ambiguities of Kafka's own attitude towards women in his fiction. Of course, as a middle-class Prague Jew, his sexual initiations probably would have been through Czech women of the chambermaid class. I'm rather fantasizing as to what the déshabillé inside Kafka's old office may be like. You know, has a rhino run amok in there with a lot of chocolate from the minibar? We just don't know. Now, at this point, my visit might have come to an end. They have once more called for my help unnecessarily. I'm used to that. With the help of my night bell, the entire region torments me, but that this time I had to sacrifice Rosa as well, this beautiful girl who lives in my house all year long and whom I scarcely notice. This sacrifice is too great, and I must somehow, in my own head, subtly rationalize it away for the moment in order not to let loose at this family who cannot, even with their best will, give me Rosa back again. But as I'm closing up my bag and calling for my fur coat, the family is standing together, the father sniffing the glass of rum in his hand, the mother probably disappointed in me. What more do these people expect? Tearfully biting her lips, and the sister flapping at a very bloody hand towel. I'm somehow ready in the circumstances to concede that the young man is perhaps none the less sick. I go to him. He smiles up at me, as if I was bringing him the most nourishing kind of soup. Ah, now. Both horses are whinnying. The noise is probably supposed to come from higher regions in order to illuminate my examination, and now I found out that yes, indeed, the young man is ill.
To the west of the old town of Prague, we went looking for the place where Kafka lived with his sister for a short time, and where he began his novel The Trial. We found that during the early years of World War I, he lived in this grisly and nondescript building, perhaps entirely appropriate for the task he had set himself.
Anyway, it took him a while to get out of home, because by the time Kafka moved into a single room in his sister's apartment in this house in 1914, he would have been 27 years old, which is, you know, taking a while to get away from home. But it's so epical moment for him, both because he began writing The Trial here and because he managed to leave home for 4 weeks. Then he went back again. The reason was, you know, notoriously Kafka said that he wished ill on all the combatants in the First War, and that he felt, you know, there's an oft retold myth that he was in some way disjointed from the impact of the First World War. But of course the reason he ended up here was because his sister's husband had been conscripted and she moved back to the family apartment and there was no space for him there. So there was a practical impact from the First War, and I think that there was a psychological impact as well. I think it is in there. I think it is in the Country Doctor. I think it is in the stories he writes throughout the First War and the novels he works on. How could it not be, you know? When Joyce was asked what he did during the First World War, he said, I wrote Ulysses, because, you know, writing a novel about the protagonist who's a Pacific Jew was his strongest possible counterpoint to the kind of Gottendammerung of the war, which he was islanded from in Switzerland. And I think Kafka, in his own way, with his own rather more kind of minatory stories and writings, was reflecting the same Gottendammerung. This is the Kafka family home in the late 1910s and into the next decade. Niklasstrasse, on a plot redeveloped after the ghetto. The old ghetto had been demolished, and it was a fancy new apartment block facing onto this bridge and facing onto the river. The bridge was unfinished at the time. The Kafkas lived on the top floor of the apartment block, and Kafka apparently dubbed the sort of pontoon of the bridge that was going out the suicide bridge. It was a productive period for him, and he was much enamored of his view from the top floor of this new apartment block, which is gone now and been replaced by this intercontinental hotel. So I think we'll go upstairs and occupy the psychic space that Kafka did at that time when he was working on the novel. He'd begun round the corner, the trial and other things. So this is really the view that we've come for. And he didn't call it the suicide bridge, he called it the suicide approach. It's here that Kafka has his celebrated literary breakthrough with this view of the bridge between September the 22nd and 23rd, 1912. From 10 o'clock in the evening until 6 o'clock in the morning, he wrote the judgment, the story of the judgment in the room here. And of course, you know, it ends with the character of Georg Benderman swinging over the balustrade of a bridge. Quotes, still clutching on with welcoming grip, he glimpsed a bus through the bars of the balustrade and knew that it would easily mask the sound of his fall. And again, in the same room, he writes Metamorphosis a few weeks later, and he writes De Verschollen, which is often titled in English America, all in this position. And you know, it's a very fine, unclaustrophobic and distinctly un-Kafkaesque view. It's more or less the peak perspective for the city. On his right side, in the region of the hip, a wound the size of the palm of one's hand has opened up, rose-coloured in many different shadings, dark in the depths, brighter on the edges, delicately grained, with uneven patches of blood open to the light like a mine. That's what it looks like from a distance. Close up, complication is apparent. Who can look at that without whistling softly? Worms, as thick and as long as my little finger, themselves rose-coloured and also spattered with blood, are wriggling their white bodies with many limbs from their stronghold in the inner part of the wound towards the light. Poor young man, there's no helping you. I have found out your great wound. You are dying from this flower on your side. The family is happy. They see me doing something. The sister says to the mother tells the father tells a few guests who are coming in on tiptoe through the moonlight of the open door, balancing themselves with outstretched arms. Will you save me? Whispers the young man, sobbing, quite blinded by the life inside his wound. That's how people are in my region, always demanding the impossible from the doctor. They have lost the old faith. The priest sits at home and tears his religious robes to pieces, one after the other. But the doctor is supposed to achieve everything with his delicate surgeon's hand. Well, it's what they like to think. I have not offered myself. If they use me for sacred purposes, I let that happen to me as well. What more do I want? An old country doctor, robbed of my servant girl. And they come, the families and the village elders, and they take my clothes off. A choir of school children with the teacher at the head stands in front of the house and sings an extremely simple melody with the words, "Take his clothes off, then he'll heal, and if he doesn't cure, then kill him. It's only a doctor, it's only a doctor." Then I am stripped of my clothes, and with my fingers in my beard and my head tilted to one side, I look at the people quietly. I am completely calm and clear about everything, and stay that way too, although it is not helping me at all, for they are now taking me by the head and feet and dragging me into bed. They lay me against the wall on the side of the wound. Then they all go out of the room. The door is shut. The singing stops. Clouds move in front of the moon. Oh! Miserable coins, tokens, pathetic shrine mentality. We have lost the old faith. We have lost the old faith, as the country doctor says. Many people have interpreted the story as being specifically about that. We have lost the old faith, and so we leave these tokens and we create new shrines out of writers and pop stars, and we come and bring them little coins. What could you wish for from Kafka? If you laid something on his grave, you laid a bolt on Kafka's grave, or is this a reference to Tarkovsky's Stalker? You throw the bolt and follow it. What could you, or the fuse, or a lighter? What could these tokens? What would you wish for from Kafka? What would your Kafka prayer be? Friends, bless me in some way. Hmm? Oh. The last months and weeks of Kafka's life were pretty grim. A succession of sanatoria in the region of Vienna. But then after death, he was tormented by tourists. Do you like his writing?
Yes. Very good. We
What?
never read a book or something, but we know him from name.
You haven't read his book?
No,
So why did you come to visit his grave?
because we are in Prague.
Okay.
It's very beautiful, the cemetery here.
Okay.
Very, very beautiful.
Maybe that's suitable in a way, that you haven't read his books, since you didn't really want them to be read. Perhaps he would have preferred that. You just came to visit his grave without having read his books. It's a kind of nice way around the whole problem of Max Brod. Max Brod's decisions. His great friend is commemorated behind you there, the man who saved his manuscript. There's a lot of what, might seem to be kind of apocryphal tales that kind of wreathe accounts of Kafka's death, and can seem like being of a piece with the sort of sanctification of him and his kind of confirmation as a kind of religious thinker that certainly Max Brod wished to take place. You know, for example, one of the nurses in the sanatorium where he died, you know, sort of said of how, you know, kind of light and simple and pure and kind of peaceful his death was. You know, he was buried here, I think the 11th of June, 1924, about 100 mourners, Hebrew prayers for the dead, and apparently the sky then darkened and rain fell, which seems a little bit too biblical to be true, but you know, maybe it was so. His father turned his back on Dora Diamant, the Austin Juden who had nursed and cared for Kafka in the last few months of his life. Though, you know, arguably this wasn't some kind of rejection, but, you know, he had, after all, just lost his oldest child and his only son. Here they all are, Herman and Julie, the father he kind of never got on with, the mother who people feel never understood that his writing was anything much more than a pastime, and the three sisters memorialized here, who all died in the Nazis' Holocaust. And now, let's dance! Let's dance. He's a funny guy. You know, I emailed somebody last night, you know, the writer Isabel Fonseca in New York, and said, you know, Kafka, a bit of a schlemiel, wasn't he? And she wrote back and said, you know, not the angst merchant of memory, a humorous writer, a funny guy, a Yiddish song and dance man. Should you stand on the right or the left? Kafka didn't stand on the right or the left, but his writing was necessarily informed by the political. He lived during a period when Bohemia was often ruled by direct fiat from Vienna, and there was considerable social unrest, the arousal of Czech nationalism, anti-Semitic riots, all sorts of brouhaha. Sorry. That was potentially nasty. But you know, montage, rapidity of movement, jerking about, slamming, posture, knocking into people. That's Kafka.
My last walk across Prague was to the Harcadney Castle, in the lee of which, during the winter of 1916-17, Kafka wrote A Country Doctor in a diminutive house lent to him by his favourite and youngest sister, Otla.
Crap uniforms, guys.
In common with much of the old town of Prague, the castle has become a tourist trap, and the room where Kafka laboured over the majority of the short fiction that was published in his lifetime is now a shop, albeit one with at least a couple of shelves dedicated to his work. What better location in which, under the eyes of marauding sightseers, to read the last section of A Country Doctor?
Dragging me into bed. They lay me against the wall on the side of the wound. Then they all go out of the room. The door is shut. The singing stops. Clouds move in front of the moon. The bedclothes lie warmly around me. In the open space of the windows, the horses' heads sway like shadows. Do you know, I hear someone saying in my ear, my confidence in you is very small. You were shaken out from somewhere. You don't come on your own feet. Instead of helping, you give me less room on my deathbed. The best thing would be if I scratch your eyes out. Right, I say. It's a disgrace. But now I'm a doctor. What am I supposed to do? Believe me, things are not easy for me either. Should I be satisfied with this excuse? Alas, I'll probably have to be. I always have to make do. I came into a world with a beautiful wound. That was all I was furnished with. Young friend, I say, your mistake is that you have no perspective. I've already been in all the sick rooms, far and wide, and I tell you, your wound is not so bad. Made in a tight corner, with 2 blows from an axe. Many people offer their side, and hardly hear the axe in the forest, to say nothing of the fact that it's coming closer to them. Is that really so? Or are you deceiving me in my fever? It is truly so. He took my word and grew still. But now it was time to think about my escape. The horses were still standing loyally in place. Clothes, fur coat and bag were quickly snatched up. I didn't want to delay by getting dressed. If the horses rushed as they had on the journey out, I should in fact be springing out of that bed into my own, as it were. One horse obediently pulled back from the window. I threw the bundle into the carriage. The fur coat flew too far and was caught on a hook by only one arm. Good enough. I swung myself up onto the horse, the reins dragging loosely. One horse barely harnessed to the other, the carriage swaying behind. Last of all, the fur coat in the snow. Giddy up, I said, but there was no giddying up about it. We dragged through the snowy desert like old men. For a long time, the fresh but inaccurate singing of the children resounded behind us. Enjoy yourselves, you patients. The doctor's laid in bed with you. I'll never come home at this rate. My flourishing practice is lost. A successor is robbing me, but to no avail, for he cannot replace me. In my house, the disgusting groom is wreaking havoc. Rosa is his victim. I will not think it through. Naked, abandoned to the frost of this unhappy age, with an earthly carriage and unearthly horses, I drive around by myself, an old man. My fur coat hangs behind the wagon, but I cannot reach it, and no one from the nimble rabble of patients lifts a finger. Betrayed, betrayed. Once one responds to a false alarm on the night bell, there's no making it good again. Not ever.
Finally, before my return to London, I reluctantly visited the minatory place to which Kafka's sisters and the bulk of the Prague Jews had been forcibly removed by the Nazis.
This is an unavoidable place, and it looms large in the European imagination, even though many people have probably never heard of it. In some senses, it's a more perfect and grotesque encapsulation of the Nazis' genocidal urges, even than the extermination camps of Treblinka and Sobibor and so forth, and the colossal industrial Buna of Auschwitz. Not that it ever really produced the rubber for which it was intended, but in some sense Terezin here is where everything comes home to roost, because the Nazis' stated aim to establish a kind of privileged concentration camp, a camp where kind of good Jews, i.e. wealthy or influential Jews, could be quartered in some way as a way of kind of skimming off the possible useful element of particularly German Jewry, was enacted in this fortress in the Sudetenland.
Conditions in the kilometre square concentration camp where anything up to 50,000 prisoners were held at any one time, were, of course, appalling. But in order to deceive Red Cross delegations in the wider world, the Nazis made a fraudulent film. The Führer gives a city to the Jews.
There's something about the star-shaped fortress of Terezin and the idea of the enormous concentration of people who moved through it. And it was to hear that almost certainly, as far as I'm aware, Kafka's sisters, including his beloved Ottla, would have been deported 40 miles or so from Prague on their way to the gas chambers. So if we think of Kafka as somehow his work casting a shadow forwards in that sense, and in some way being itself an instantiation of this kind of dreadful ironizing of the 20th century, the metamorphosis, the writing about the peculiar status of European Jewry in stories like Jackals and Arabs, or a report to the Academy, and even in The Country Doctor, which has this sense of alienation from the people who surround him, then this is where the shadow is being cast. But somehow Theresienstadt lies at the heart of this essay project, this linkage between Paul Fussell's observations in The Great War and Modern Memory of the enormous impact of the first few months of the First World War on European consciousness, the incredible dramatic reversal between the armies going to war full of chivalrous 19th century ideas of the conduct of war, and then becoming bogged down in the quagmire of the Western Front. A strange linkage between that and the wound as described in Kafka's The Country Doctor. The gaping wound in the young boy's side, written in 1917 when Princip, Gavrilo Princip, the Serbian assassin of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, would have been coughing his last here at Terezin, the most famous inmate of this camp.
People from Czech Republic, they were concentrated in Prague.
My guide to the concentration camp of Theresienstadt was Susanna.
155,000 people, 87,000 from them were sent to
The first place we went to in the concentration camp of Theresienstadt was the cell in the so-called small fortress where Gavrilo Princip was held.
It's the irony that he was too young to be executed, and that he came to be imprisoned in a place that subsequently became a death camp, in essence, and that he wanted to die himself. I think he took cyanide. Did he not try and commit suicide himself? Yeah. And tuberculosis is such a strange thing because, of course, it was rife in European cities at that time, in the 1900s, in all forms. And people think of the ghetto in particular as incubating tuberculosis, don't they, the disease? Okay, well, we better go on.
So when the people came to this small fortress, they had to stand up there on this wall, face to the wall, and there were long, long hours waiting for the registration. In this time they were beaten and tortured, and then were called to this office here. And they had the prisoners hand over the documents and all expensive things, and they've got a number, but it was not tattoo. The tattoo they've got only in Auschwitz.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And were your family always from around here? No. You came here.
My mother was German Jewish, and for 100 people was only one sink, one toilet.
You say that a lot of the inmates here would have been Czech political prisoners.
Yeah.
And would they have been communists, partisans?
Yeah, this is all together, yeah. This was
Yeah.
communism.
Anybody who was suspected of being against the Nazis or against, would have been brought here.
These were mostly people that made small things. Yeah, they wrote about Nazis, something against Nazis,
Yeah.
or they said
something. Somebody must have been talking about Joseph K.
Yeah.
Somebody must have been spreading
This is the
rumours.
same as homosexuals. Yeah, they must be.
So this is the shower block, not a gas chamber, but the shower block for the inmates in the Gestapo prison. So, the iconography, it's hardly possible to think of a shower block in a concentration camp in an innocent sense. But this actually was a shower block, but the clothes were brought here. It will be a whole day of showering the camp inmates. Another example of the Nazis' kind of delight in a sort of institutional bricolage, because they would bring the inmates in, they'd all be lined up in the courtyard for the whole day, brought in and in drafts of 100 at a time. The clothes go into this to be deloused, but only by steam, no chemicals involved. So all of the lice and the bed bugs actually survived the process. So it was absolutely pointless. They go through this steamer for no point at all, in the Straf colony. And then, meanwhile, the inmates, 100 at a time, are brought into this shower area here, 5 to each nozzle. In first women, who would have some warm water, and then the men, who would have cold water, and then the Jews, who really would hardly have any water at all. And then back out this way to pick up the deloused clothing and back out into the yard. The whole process taking 5 minutes for every 100 inmates. A sense of decay and pointlessness. So, the living space for the concentration camp inmates was estimated to be 1.6 meters of space per individual. So this would be kind of roomy. I've never ever wanted to visit a concentration camp, Theodor Adorno said that after Auschwitz, poetry was impossible.